My name is Catherine Clement, and I'm the creator and curator of the Paper Trail Project. Many of you I recognize as familiar faces, but the Paper Trail Project is a crowdsourced archive, as well as an exhibition, as well as micro exhibitions in other parts of the country. We just opened up one in Victoria, called Victoria in the Time of Exclusion. We have one in Toronto, have one in Montreal. So it's a lot of programming, a lot of workshops over this, and the show has been extended until the end of this year, which is wonderful. And lastly, it will be a large commemorative book that we'll be publishing to sort of bring it all to a close and all the stories that we heard, not all of them, obviously, there'll be a huge book, but to bring together all of this work and to really have a book specifically about Canada's Exclusion Act and exclusion period. But what we're here today is to talk about Humiliation Day. And what's interesting, what I love about the kind of work I do is as a community historian, is that exhibitions bring stories into 3 dimensions. They allow you to move through a story, to discover a story, to look at things on the wall, things in drawers, films. But the disadvantage of that kind of storytelling is that you only have so much space. And so you have to sacrifice things. A lot of content ends up on the cutting room floor. And I wanted to really do an exhibition which talked about the experience of exclusion, the human experience of exclusion. But as a result, I had to cut some things that are part of the story, specifically what I'm going to talk about today. And so what I'm presenting today, I give very, very little space to in the other room. So this is the chance to actually fill in part of the story of what our community went through and all the things they tried to do to stop the Exclusion Act and stop the registration. And because we call it the paper trail, I'm going to tell it to you, show it to you through paper. Because there basically is no one left to tell us this story. And even if they were still here, they'd be 100 years old and they would have been children at the time. So it's paper that helps us fill in what happened and when it happened. I'm also going to rely mainly on English newspapers because 1, I don't read Chinese, and 2, it's interesting to see how the English newspapers pick up how this story unfolds. So as many of you who have been on my tour know, the Exclusion Act had sort of 2 major components to it. And one was exclusion, and the second was this mass mandatory registration. And those who have been on my tours know that it's that registration which caused the most angst. And it was the registration that happened over the course of a year. But if we back up, what's interesting is what we start to find in the newspapers, and again, you may not be able to see it very well, so I'm going to do a bit of reading, is this debate around exclusion started long before the Exclusion Act came in. And what's interesting is when you look through the records, is to find this story from February the 22nd, 1922. And that headline says it all: Chinese immigrants to Canada to be registered and fingerprinted. Now, in those days, fingerprints were only for criminals. It was only used in the judicial system, not anywhere else. So you can imagine how the community feels when these stories start to come out. This is 1922, so the government's still thinking about what this Exclusion Act's going to be, how far we're going to go. And this is over a year later. This is the Montreal Star from May 10th. And this is a subhead, but it says, treated like criminals. And the quote is, and about fingerprints, we are being treated as though every Chinese is a criminal. Show us a race immigrating to Canada that gives less trouble than the Chinese. So even over a year later, the community is trying to fight this one thing, which is that we all have to be fingerprinted going forward. So May 10th, what we're going to find is that May and June of 1923 and May and June of 1924 are very tumultuous periods of time. This is from the Toronto Star, April 30th, 1923. So again, the act hasn't come in yet. But we find these articles in the Chinese and the English press about Chinese from coast to coast meeting to protest against the bill. And it says here, this meeting takes place in Victoria, and over 1,000 Chinese, many of them coming from other parts of the country, are descending upon Victoria, and they're starting to talk about this bill that's being written in Ottawa and what they're going to do. So they're trying to get a sense of getting organized. We need to stop this. And what's interesting, too, about Victoria, so we opened up a small exhibition there on Friday, and when the Chinese Canadian Museum asked if I'd be interested in doing an exhibition there, I said yes. And one of the reasons was that, and I've said this to others before, is that the whole idea of the head tax and the idea of exclusion all came out of the British Columbia. We were the biggest advocates of that was this province. It moved forward all this legislation. And so it was very, very fitting that in some ways the biggest activism was the Victoria community. So it's interesting that they come from all over Canada to this meeting in late April 1923, trying to find some way to get organized to stop the overall act. And you'll see the subhead says, new immigration regulations exclude families of merchants, tourists, clergy, scientists, and teachers. And you cannot change your occupation halfway through. So a lot of concern about what this is going to mean. Now, interestingly, for some of you, you know that for the longest time, the Chinese Immigration Acts over time allowed in merchants, and merchants didn't have to pay the head tax. And so, but what became a concern for the government is that there was too many people coming in saying they were merchants. And so this is another subhead from the Montreal Gazette, May 1st, 1923, talking again about how there were just too many people coming in under this. And so now we got to start closing up how we define a merchant. So basically, they're starting to look at every loophole that's being used by the Chinese community, and we're going to start closing these things up. And there's a line here that this honorable told me, urged that the people of Canada must wake up to the gravity of the Oriental invasion. In 1921, no less than 1,145 Chinamen had come to Canada as merchants. So they're thinking that category is too loose now. So that's why we got to look at how we can close up merchants and certainly not allow them to bring their families here. So this is from the Kamloops Telegram, May 3rd, so all around the same time. And this is someone who's suggesting that really we should confine the idea of merchant only to those who are engaged in import and export. So this again goes back to the fact that merchants, even if you were a businessman, a successful businessman, that didn't matter. This idea of what a merchant is becomes a real sore point. And then he goes on to suggest at the end, or someone else, a McBride, who we well know, suggests that maybe we should give them money to go back, give them the head tax back if you'll leave the country. So again, this is all going on while the legislation is still going through its bits and pieces. Sorry. So originally, exemption, these were the people that didn't have to pay the head tax, included a number of different groups. So initially, it was diplomats and government officials, which makes sense, students, and a lot of our ancestors came in as students, tourists, merchants, clergy, scientists, and teachers. So all those groups had been open to come and not have to pay the head tax, even though they would still get a landing certificate and be monitored. But the debate happens around, well, we're going to really, really restrict this. So we're going to take out tourists, clergy, scientists, and teachers. We're going to have diplomats and government officials only, students, but we're going to define what that is. And lastly, merchants. And we're going to define what that is too. And so with students, it became, well, it couldn't be any kind of student, that you had to attend a sanctioned university or college, which meant you had to know how to speak English to enter a Canadian university or college, which that meant that eliminated a whole bunch of young people who could have come as students because they couldn't speak. And the other part of it that they were proposing is that you had to leave right after your studies were complete. So no staying afterwards. And merchants, and we're going to look at how they more narrowly defined it. They're going to really make it really, really tightly define what a merchant is. So there'll be no questions about that. And lastly, that no new merchant families be allowed to immigrate. So people like the Yips that ran this building were pretty safe because he already had his wives here and his children here, and he would have a legacy. He had descendants here. But for other merchants who had been, saving up and hoping one day they could bring their family over, this really stopped all that. So later in May, around the middle of May, the Chinese decide, okay, well, we got to get really serious here now because they're writing the law and we need to do something about this. So they wind up going to the Senate. So a number of a delegation goes to the Senate, sitting in the Senate gallery, bringing some papers with them, some documents to talk about what their concerns were. And it had been prepared by a lawyer for them. And this is another from the province of the same day. And what's interesting here, though, is what happens to them when they're at the Senate. So I'll just read this. I can barely read it myself. Each member of the upper chamber received a copy of a voluminous petition on behalf of the Chinese Canadian Association of Canada, which was prepared by their solicitor. It was a document of 18 foolscap pages and is so voluminous that the majority of the recipients discarded it without any perusal. So basically, they ignored it. And I can't imagine how soul-crushing that was to make this last-ditch effort to have people, again, travel. And it was hard to travel in those days if you're coming from the West, to go before the Senate, which was your last-ditch effort to try to prevent and to change parts of the legislation, and to have them completely ignore the document you'd put together. And of course, in that document, they itemized other kinds of concerns besides the idea of narrowing what the classes that could come in. One of the big concerns, and this comes up even more the next year, is the registration of naturalized Chinese. So Chinese who had been here a long time, who had settled here, and but who would have to register. the registration of Canadian-born, and we'll look at how that gets played out later on, that merchants who registered and whose businesses failed would be treated as laborers, and they would have to cough up the $500 head tax right away or get deported. The other thing they were concerned about is having to remember an account, because they were going to be part of the registration involved interrogation. You were going to have to bring in 3 photos of yourself and answer a barrage of questions. So people were concerned if they'd been here 40 years, like, can I remember everything? Every place I've lived, every place I've worked in all that time. Of course, there were a lot of fears for people who came in as paper sons and paper daughters, like what's going to happen when they show up to register. And another concern, of course, that there was no right of appeal. So whatever the decision was, that's what you had to live with. And lastly, of course, this concern about fines, jail, and deportation. So the punishment was harsh if you didn't register. It was harsh if you failed as a merchant. It was harsh all around. And that's one of the reasons why they called this the Cruelty Act, which is a word that they used 100 years ago to sum up what they thought of this. So, as many of you know, the Act comes in a year ago, last year, 100 years, July 1st, 1923. It's chosen for its symbolism. It goes by the very innocuous name, the Chinese Immigration Act, 1923, but we know it as the Exclusion Act. But it's just the beginning of this 1 year of registration. It's the beginning of what becomes an even more tumultuous year for the community, which I had found surprising, but we discovered in the research that we did. So the first thing they do, the government, is they define a merchant. Now, if you can read this and understand this, so merchant, as used in this act, shall not include any person who does not devote his undivided attention to mercantile pursuits and who has less than $2,500 invested in a business, dealing exclusively in goods grown, produced, or manufactured in China, or in exporting to China goods grown, produced, and manufactured in Canada, and who has not conducted such business for a period of at least 3 years. Any merchant's clerk or other employee, any tailor, mechanic, huckster, peddler, or person engaged in taking, drying, or otherwise preserving fish for home consumption or exportation, or having any connection whatsoever, with the restaurant, laundry, or rooming house. So it means you have to be an import-export full-time and have at least $2,500, which is a lot of money, invested in that business. And that's what a merchant is now, because there was calls to define it, so now they have defined it. But it's a very difficult bar to jump. And you have had to at least be 3 years doing this. So it didn't allow anyone who maybe started off having a restaurant and who decided to open up an import-export, that wouldn't count. So then this poster is made to go out, and it's basically asking everybody to register. And people have to register in different places depending on where you lived. And many of you have heard that some people had to go to an RCMP detachment, so you had to go to the police to register. And I can imagine what that was like. And then this is the language that every person of Chinese origin or descent, irrespective of allegiance or citizenship, is required to register by the 30th day of June 1923. And they must produce their landing certificate and 3 untouched and unmounted copies of a photograph of themselves. Actually, that should say 1924. Anyway. So that happens July 1st. And then on August 21st, we find this story comes out. This is from Regina. And RCMP to round up Chinese for registration and photos. And again, I'm always conscious of what people would have been reading and hearing at the time. How is this feeding into their fears of what's about to take place? Like, that is a very startling headline. They'll be rounded up, forced in. Before they were talking about fingerprints for us. Now it's the RCMP that's going to come and register us. And how does that make a community feel? So, interestingly, I looked up the other day who was the first person that actually registered. And initially, I thought I found him because I found the person who had the CI-44, which was the registration form the government kept, and he was 00001. But it turns out he was not the first person. The first person by actual date was this fellow here, Liang Hong, who went by the name of Harry Hamilton. And I thought that was interesting. So the first thing you see is Harry Hamilton. And he's living in Ottawa, and he owns a restaurant. So he's not a merchant. He owns a restaurant. And I discover he is one of several Hamiltons, Chinese Hamiltons living in Ottawa, who go relatively early. Like, they're all registering in August, and he registers August 10th. So he is the first person that registers. And what also I discovered in looking at all these registration forms is that the majority of the early ones are actually registering in Eastern Canada. So different experience there, or I don't know why that is, but Eastern Canada is where you see the early ones starting to register. Many of you know that in that year, who have been on my tours, that there's this act comes in, you're supposed to register, the registrations slowly start to begin. But we also see, and we covered this in this exhibition, of what happens, of how many people start to give up. Like, that 1 year is so painful and tumultuous. And so we find these newspaper articles of people saying goodbye. They're almost all old men who are saying, you know, I love their words, like, still struggling in places where I don't belong. I think I might have it here. This fellow who says, I grew up in a poor family and from an early age had to migrate overseas. I endured and survived the vicissitudes of life, but now I'm almost 70 years old, still struggling in places where I don't belong. And I think that's amazing, like, to spend almost all your life in a place where you don't feel at home. And in his case, he's asking for money to go back. So this is something we found in the Wong Clan Society. So there's a number of letters that we found there of men who are begging for money to go back in this period. And then, of course, in our research, we started to find all these suicides, both in the Chinese newspapers, which cover some of the same ones. Mostly the Chinese papers cover other ones that aren't covered. So December 23 from Nelson. This one is in Vancouver. This one's from Golden, BC. This is Ottawa. It's Cranbrook, Toronto, Vancouver. And these are just some of them. We also find notices of men that have gone missing, especially in the Chinese newspapers, where people are asking, have you seen, Wang Chao? Who has seen him? Where has he gone? And in this 1 year, so there's always suicides in the community, but in that 1 year, we see so many more of them in the newspaper research that we did. Someone gone missing. This is a letter out of Montreal. And one of the things that for those who had planned to stay, it was really this issue around, again, the registration. So he's making the point that under this law, it would be unnecessary to register all Chinese, maybe just some, but not all, because the majority of them are residents for over 5 years, and therefore are legally entitled to remain in this country. And Canadian-born Chinese are legal British subjects. And he goes on to say, this act provides that all Chinese, irrespective of their allegiance or citizenship, need to register. People of other nationalities who are Canadian-born are not required to do this. And so this gets interesting because it has to do around things called naturalization, where if you're living in a place long enough, you almost can move towards that idea of becoming a citizen or a resident. In this case, it was British subject. But it was just a residency requirement. And as soon as you made that threshold, then you were okay. But the Chinese were the only exception, that it didn't matter how long you had been here, you were scooped up in this. And also, if you had children here, if you were naturalized, then your children automatically were British subjects. But again, we know of what happened to the children who were born here. They were all required to get an immigration card. So this was a letter to the editor that was published in April of 1924. So these things are going on. People are slowly starting to register, but there's still a bit of this fight left in the community to do something. And it really all comes to a head in June 1924. So we're leading into that last 30 days where everybody has to register. And everybody gives it one more kick. So one of the things we noticed is that a lot of registrations happen in June. People are beginning to realize we're not going to win this fight. And so we start finding a lot of photographs being done. We find a lot of photographs being done in 1924 by local photographers. But you also see this, this was an ad that Yu Chow studio put in, sort of remember this date, or, this kind of date that will live in infamy, and remember June 30th, got to get your photos done. So a lot of families, a lot of photos done at that time. From a photographer's point of view, or someone who studies photographic history, it's like a gold mine, because so many people were photographed that year. In the middle of the month, the community, kind of in this almost act of desperation now and defeat, makes the call to call July 1st, 1924, so today, Humiliation Day. And they choose that word carefully. Humiliation is if you think about that word, is much stronger than the word embarrassment or ashamed. It goes to a whole different level. And this is where they begin to say, okay, as a community, looks like we're going to lose this fight. And so we're calling on the community across Canada to think about this day differently, to register our anger over what's happening by putting in mourning wreaths, by lowering the Canadian flag to half-mast, by having meetings and parades and protests, all these different ideas that they had, that they were trying to get the community across Canada to do. There's also kind of like another last-ditch effort by this fellow. His name is David Liu, and he was out of Vancouver here. He was sort of a businessman, very tied into the white community, and he, with kind of a scholarly legal mind, and he decides he's going to do a final Hail Mary and see what he can do to stop what's going to happen. And so basically he says, okay, some of us aren't going to register, and we dare you to take us to court because we think we can win this one in the courts, and especially at the Supreme Court. So he says the measure will be ignored and the prosecution will be welcomed to test the legality of the provisions. So again, this is the middle of June. And then he writes this paper, and basically it says here, it has been held by the Privy Council that every alien who is naturalized in Canada becomes a Canadian subject of the King, and also that his children are not aliens. And by this legislation, it is sought to take away the rights and privileges which are clearly entitled to as affirmed by the highest court in British Columbia, in the British Empire. We question the right of the Dominion of Parliament to pass such a law and single us out from other races residing in this province and to put a contemptuous stigma on our race. So again, when I do my tours, I talk about one of the big newspaper articles which originally said all Asians, all types of Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Hindus, Sikhs, would all be encompassed in the legislation, but in the end, only Chinese are singled out. And it stings, and I think he says it so well when he talks about this stigma just on us. So this is David Liu. So he's challenging the government to take people to court if they don't register. And then we have, so this is from the Winnipeg Free Press. At the same time, again, Chinese to observe Humiliation Day. So now this is growing momentum that they're going to observe it. Also, June 18th is we start seeing these articles, mainly in Victoria, about the Chinese crowding to the registration booths. So people are leaving it to the last minute, but I think they're at this point now where they realize there's just no way we're going to be able to stop this train that's happening. And so they start lining up. And that's interestingly because you start to see the results of it a little bit later. But he's not going to give up this David Liu. So in late June, June 27th, he decides he's going back to Ottawa. He's going to try one more time and to raise the objection. So this is like 3 days before the deadline now. And what's interesting is that we have never been able to find David Liu's registration document. So I think he made good on his threat. And this is June, the same day again, and how the Chinese are awaiting news from Ottawa. They're still holding their breath. Maybe we can turn this thing around. So the registration deadline comes, it's June 30th, 1924, so yesterday, 100 years ago. And we find, interestingly, that a lot of the children, so the CI-45 was the one mainly given to Canadian-born children, and we find that a lot of those are dated June 30th. So families waited very late, because they couldn't believe that they would need to register their Canadian-born children. So they leave it late. And that's how I kept on seeing them early on, like, why are they all June 30th or June 29th? I found that 2,408 people left it to the very last day. And of those, 227 were children, the Canadian-born children, and a lot of them in Vancouver. So this, again, is just showing you how you see on these cards here, often June 30th. This is from Lillooet. This is from Winnipeg, June 30th. This is from Manitoba again, June 30th. So people hanging on as long as they could. Strangely, though, this little guy here is July 3rd, 1924, but maybe they came in and the paperwork wasn't completed until July 3rd. Also, what happens, of course, is what happens to, this is CI 30, so this is someone who came in as a merchant originally. He came in 1921, March. And so when he goes in to register, his business has failed. And it must have been so nerve-wracking. Like, what are they going to do to me, right? These powerful, angry white men. And in the end, he is fined. So interestingly, so he registers on May 4th, but he's fined on May 26th. So they must have reviewed his application and then decided to fine him, and he comes back on May 26th. And this is basically as a handwritten note. We've seen a few of these, all on merchant certificates. This is to certify that Hum Wing Goon, whose photograph appears on the face, has paid, Canada the sum of $500, he having ceased to belong to the exempt class under which he was admitted to Canada. So we find a lot of these men who obviously had to cough up and get a loan to pay this. But then we find a number of other ones like this. So this is also a CI 30, so someone who came in without paying the head tax. Also in 1921, so again, the government's concerned, too many of these so-called merchants coming in, which leads them to tighten up. And he has nothing on the back. And we have found a number of these sitting in the archives of other merchants, like the H.Y. Louis family, the London Drug, IGA family. This is from another family, but it's interesting what happened. Did he not register and decide to just try to risk staying in Canada? Did he go back? Did he only come to Canada in an effort to actually go into the United States? We know that some did slip over because there was an Exclusion Act in the US. But interesting, these are mostly found in merchants' archives. A lot of certificates who the family doesn't know who any of these people are, but it was in Granddad's vault. So we don't know what the story is behind these. Here's another one. And again, empty. So again, he comes in 1921 as a merchant and goes AWOL. So there was this paper here which talks about that initially the number of people registered, I think this is, June, I forgot to put the date here. This is like July 15th or whatever, that there were initially 40,331 people that registered. So you may say, why do we have 56 there? Because people actually do register afterwards. We find people who were in China at the time and come back, register at that time. Many people sent their children over. When all this started coming down, they sent their children over to China. And when those children came back, usually in the 30s, they would be registered. So the total number at the very end is much higher. And it changes even as the year goes by. So there was a call to do Humiliation Day 100 years ago today. And it's really interesting to see what did or did not happen across Canada. So even though the call was for all Chinese, especially in those with more substantial Chinatowns, to do something, it didn't come off quite like that. So in Halifax, all the way over, they had 189 people registered, Chinese registered in Halifax, so a small community. But they actually did observe Humiliation Day. And they did some events and some sort of parade protest to mark the day. What does it say here? In Montreal, there were 3,116 Chinese registered, so sizable. But they decided we don't want to insult Canada. We don't want to lower the flags to half-mast. It's an insult to other Canadians. So very polite in many ways. And they had a few meetings, but that was about the extent of it. Even though they had a good population. Yeah, they thought it would be foolish to take such drastic action on Canada's birthday. Toronto. We can't really find anything about Toronto. There were 4,118 Chinese there. And interestingly, the Ontario Chinese Association did leading a lot of the initial lobbying before the act came in. And yet, the only kind of articles on July 2nd were just how many people enrolled in Toronto. So really very, very quiet there. Ottawa, 464 Chinese registered there, and they decided not to have a demonstration. Even though they said, we're just as bothered by it, but we're not going to do anything. Winnipeg does a bit better. They have 1,422 people living there. And they do observe Humiliation Day with mass meetings and a protest. Interestingly, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, has 435 Chinese there, and they do something. they have a pretty good event, and meetings and protests, and so little Moose Jaw there. Saskatoon, right nearby, 389 people. They also observe it, somewhat low-key. So it's mainly meetings. It's nothing really too big and fancy. So meetings during the afternoon. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading this. Calgary, 1,320. We don't really find anything there happening again. Instead, the articles are very much about how many people registered. Victoria had 6,644 people. And they stage an orderly protest, but they probably do the best one in Canada of all. They get cars involved, automobiles. They have this 700 people gathering at a theater. They apparently wear little buttons or badges. We don't know what it said, but they do go all out. They have a street parade. And as I said earlier, they were most activist, and they were right next door, of course, to the legislature where all this stuff had originated, all these ideas. So Vancouver, this surprised me. There were 14,274 Chinese living in Vancouver. So the biggest population was here. And many of the big clan societies had their headquarters here. And yet they made no protest. And they said, well, we're going to wait for David Liu to come back to decide what we're going to do. And I wonder, I have no one to ask, why would Vancouver have not done something? Why did Moose Jaw do something and other cities didn't? What was the difference that led to this different reaction, even though they were all really peeved about what happened? So even though Vancouver didn't do a protest, there was a little bookstore here that did a songwriting contest and decided to invite people to submit songs to commemorate July 1st. And this was the winning song. We found this in the Wong Clan Association's scrapbook. And interestingly, our translator said the way they they translated the literal translation of the word Vancouver is cloudy town. So I thought that was really sweet, cloudy town. And it says, never forget July 1st. The heart-rending July 1st marks our subjection to the act, to the stifling, escalating fear, like a lamb to the slaughter. The sufferings under the cruel 43 are irreparable, are our embodied memories, our roots of hope to end the white peril, to end the shame, to become avengers of the oppressed people. So I always think about the words they're using: subjugation, escalating fear, humiliation, cruelty, treated like criminals. All of these things are revealing about how a community, for many of us who are Chinese Canadian or have Chinese Canadian blood, how they felt 100 years ago. And it was interesting because as I was coming down here, I heard the drumming circle over there across at the Chinese Cultural Center, so I went over to check it out. And there was these nice banners, Happy Canada Day. And after working on this presentation and after working on this exhibition and over the last few years, I couldn't feel the same way today, especially. Maybe next year it'll be different, but I understand why they talk about a day of mourning, and in some ways I feel like that today, 100 years later. I feel mournful for what my community had to go through and how they could never talk about it with us. So, how am I doing on time? Oh, okay, I gotta stop. I just want to tell you two other little things. So these are the words that they used. David Liu. So 1924, he was killed later that year, assassinated, just down the street. We don't know why, there's all sorts of speculation. It remains a cold case to this day. And I know my friend Andrew there has done all sorts of research on David Liu. So it was huge when he was assassinated on the street. The other thing that happened in 1924, after all this other crap, was this famous murder that happened. And this is what was called Janet Smith, Shaughnessy housemaid, who was shot, and they thought she had committed suicide. And it turned out, later on, there was the belief that it was actually the Chinese house servant that had killed her, that he had longed for her, and that somehow something happened and he had shot her. And it had all sorts of repercussions. There was actually a talk about having a bill that would prevent Chinese men working in houses with white women. So all of this fear of Chinese and all this story was happening too, was a huge story of, in the end he was found that there wasn't enough evidence but he got kidnapped because the cops wanted him to confess, and he wouldn't confess, so they kidnapped him and they held him for 45 days, and then finally released him. It's just one of those crazy stories. But that's all happening in that same year. So I don't want to always be a downer. And I realize that for all of this, the community has been remarkable. And that as soon as it could, as soon as it was released from the shackles of the Exclusion Act and as soon as it was able to get citizenship, it became truly this model minority we talk about. And there were so many people that survived at so many what we call our plum blossoms, the people that just survived that harsh cold of winter and came through the other side. And that's, for many of us, we are the descendants of those who made it through. So it's a good story in the end, but I It's important that we remember what we've come through, what the journey has been in this country. Thank you very much for coming tonight.